Okay, this is part 3 of our introductory chapter. Because it's kind of an introductory chapter, there's also not going to be some great segues throughout. This is kind of an amalgam of things I want to make sure that you guys are familiar with. Some of you may have had some biology, some of you may have not. So one of the things I just want to quickly cover are some of the characteristics of life. This list, no matter what text you read, you will come across different characteristics of life. So this is just my list that I've compiled. Some people could argue for others and against some that are on my list. But for simplification, I've just tried to keep it to some of the most basics. And my cats are fighting right now. All right. So first is order. Life is complex. Even if we take the most simplest living organism, its level of complexity by far exceeds that of non-living things. All right. Next one is responsiveness. Which I also called irritability. Responsiveness or irritability just refers to the ability to respond to stimuli. Okay, so all living things have this responsiveness. Even a single-celled organism has the ability to respond to stimuli. Next one is digestion. If this was more of a biology class and its focus was on all living things, I would actually be calling this energy utilization. But since this is human, we can just call it digestion instead. Growth, all living things, no matter how small or how short-lived, they all have a period of growth. Metabolism, I'm kind of throwing this one in here. Metabolism just refers to the sum of all chemical reactions. And it's really, this is kind of a simplification to just call it the sum of all chemical reactions. If you've had more advanced biology class, it deals with transfer of high energy phosphate groups, but we're just going to call metabolism the sum of all chemical reactions. And the two types, if we think about it, if you eat cheese, the protein in that cheese, you'll break it down into amino acids. You'll use those amino acids to build your own protein. And that kind of summarizes the two types. We're going to have catabolism. Catabolism or the breaking down. And then we're going to have anabolism, which are your building. All right. And if you ever get confused between the two, just kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the term anabolic steroids. Anabolic reactions are these building reactions. All right. So that's metabolism, the two types. Catabolism, these breaking down reactions. Anabolism, these building reactions. Evolution, all living things evolve. This gets kind of tricky because a single living organism doesn't evolve, only populations do. But nevertheless, it is a characteristic of life. All right, only a few more. The whole purpose of life is to propagate the species. So we have reproduction has to be a characteristic of life. And you'll see this at the cellular level. So if we're a multicellular organism, we are these multicellular organisms. So we have to be able to reproduce the cells as well as reproducing the organism itself. And then lastly, this, again, some would tie this back to irritability, but homeostasis. Homeostasis just refers to this steady state. And actually the rest of this lecture is going to focus on homeostasis. So we are going to be talking about this in much greater detail. So those are the characteristics of life. Now, for homeostasis, we take a look. If you step outside and it's 30 degrees, or if it's 100 degrees, your body temperature is going to be the same, 98.6 ballpark, or 37 degrees Celsius, right? So your body has the ability to keep internal environment steady in spite of a dynamic external environment. And it achieves this via different ways. So there are going to be these levels of regulation. So we're going to be talking about the nervous system and the endocrine system. That is going to be this extrinsic control of a homeostatic mechanism. We're going to have an intrinsic, which nervous system we do not need innervation. It will be intrinsic, the ability of the heart to beat, that is intrinsic. But in terms of regulation, we can have blood vessels respond automatically. And then we're going to have cellular. All right, so these are different levels of regulation: extrinsic, intrinsic, and cellular. So now for homeostasis, here's the definition of homeostasis: the ability to maintain a stable internal environment in spite of a dynamic external environment. So, how does this happen? Okay. So, what we do is we take a look at homeostatic control mechanism. All of them are going to share certain attributes. So, let's say we have some variable that produces a change in the body. Let's say it's hot outside. So, your body temperature, that's the variable, is the external temperature. The change in the body would be your body temperature increasing. All homeostatic control mechanisms have to consist of three different things: a receptor that will be able to detect that your body temperature is rising, a control center. Control center typically is dealing with some sort of nervous system. This is the black box. It is going to receive information from the receptor, and then the effector is going to be whatever the response is. Okay. So here we can take a look at this. Here is where we are in homeostasis. A variable produces a change. Receptor is going to sense that change, pass that information off to the control center. The control center will determine what the output is, what the response is. It will send that to the effector. Effector will then respond accordingly. Now, what that response does to this variable, we have two different types. We can have a negative feedback or a positive feedback. A negative feedback mechanism, the deviation from the set point triggers a response. This response, this is the effector, that reduces the deviation from the set point. So think about it. If the temperature outside starts rising, so then your body temperature starts rising, it goes to this control center, and then we're going to have our effector. And what is the effector if we're overheating? We can have sweat, we can have vasodilation, all sorts of things. All of that, what that is meant to do is bring body temperature back down. So our initial effect was this increase. So we had this deviation from our set point, and the response was to bring this back down. That is a negative feedback. Another example would be blood glucose levels. Okay. Our homeostasis is around 90. So let's say you just eat. So the stimulus, your blood glucose levels are going to rise. That is going to tell cells of the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin tells the cells to take up glucose. Blood glucose levels come back down, right? So the variable was rise in blood glucose levels. The effector caused blood glucose levels to come back down, right? Deviation from the set point, the reaction reduces that deviation from the set point. Let's say you haven't eaten in a while, your blood glucose levels drop. Other cells of the pancreas, actually right next to the cells that release insulin, they release glucagon, which tells the liver to break down glycogen. we'll get into this later. Glycogen is just a whole bunch of glucose linked together, and it breaks it up into glucose, dumps it into the blood. Our blood glucose levels come back normal. Okay. So we have so many of these homeostatic control mechanisms. One of the things that we can do is we can take a look at how closely regulated this is. And just so you know, you don't have to worry about this in example. I will cover this later. So gain, high gain, means that it's very highly regulated, that very small deviations from the set point are going to cause a response. The example is blood pH. Low gain, loosely regulated. It will allow some deviations from the set point before an effector, before a response is produced. And blood pressure is an example of that, right? So we have high gain and low gain. So those are negative feedback mechanisms. Now keep in mind, I can give you an example of a homeostatic control mechanism and not tell you if it's negative or positive and ask you to identify if it is. So you just have to kind of think about what the variable is and then what the response is. So for positive feedback, the output, what that effector does is it exaggerates that original stimulus. So it can promote rapid change. Think about it this way. In your house, your HVAC is a negative feedback mechanism. If it starts to get cold, the thermostat, it gets away from a set point and then the heat comes on, right? To reduce that deviation from the set point. With a positive feedback, what would end up happening is your house would get cold, then the AC would kick on. Your house would get colder, the AC would kick on even more. So positive feedback mechanisms are rare for maintaining homeostasis, but you'll see in certain examples they are. But because it can promote this rapid change, we pay the price for that. So I'm only going to give you two examples. One is blood clotting. So this gets tricky. Students want to say, okay, you're bleeding, you stop bleeding. That's negative feedback. And we have to take a look at this cellular response. What ends up happening is when platelets in our blood come across connective tissue, these platelets will swell, grow spikes, and get sticky. They also release chemicals. These chemicals attract more platelets to show up. All of these platelets will then go through that same process of swelling, growing spikes, getting sticky, and then release even more chemicals. So then we have even more platelets show up, so on and so forth. And all of these platelets will aggregate and allow a clot to form. And we're going to talk about in 169 the problem that we have because blood clotting is a positive feedback mechanism. One, we have to have controls that will limit the clot to just the site of injury, and also talk about how we pay the price, having strokes or embolisms. Another example of a positive feedback is delivery. So once the head of the fetus pushes against the cervix, it sends impulses to the brain. The brain stimulates the pituitary gland to release oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and pushes the fetus more towards the cervix so that there's greater pressure on the cervix, more impulses to the brain, more oxytocin is released, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is also a positive feedback cycle. Open loop control systems, I just want you to identify, to be aware that they're out there. A system does not use feedback to determine if the output has achieved the goal. Snapping fingers, talking are examples. Again, I want you to be aware that we can have some control systems that have no feedback loops. So they are referred to as open loop control systems. And that is it for part 3.